solid. Oh,
Tell us if I'm standing in the right spot.
yes, perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
I walk around a lot, so if I get out of line, you just tell me. This is so great and so exciting to be here. I appreciate the invitation. Wade has been my boss, and worked together for some 25 years. So appreciate the opportunity to be here, and sure love this valley, and wish I lived up here. It's so beautiful. I bet you guys hear that all the time, and maybe that's here. You don't want to hear that anymore a little bit. But you got a beautiful thing going on here. So really exciting and happy to be here. I can really get rolling. So if you guys have questions as I start to talk, please don't hesitate to just give a hand, and we can ask questions as we go along. That's totally great. I figured tonight what we would do is just start from a 30,000 foot discussion, and then kind of zero into how things would work specific to the endeavor that you guys are engaged in right now. And like I said, as I go through, if you have questions, please just stop me. So land use in Utah. Okay, so Utah is actually a really interesting state as it relates to other states in the country. Okay, so sometimes when you're looking at, like if you were just to Google land use control, land use authority, and you looked at other states, you'd hear things about something called Dillon's rule and some other things like that. Those things that you're reading outside of Utah typically don't apply here. We have a rule in the state that's called the Hutchinson rule. And the Hutchinson rule, basically, it stands for the idea that municipalities, legislative bodies of municipalities, while they are a political subdivision of the state, meaning they're a creation of the state, there is broad authority in Utah unless it's specifically prohibited by state law. Okay, so we'll talk about what that means in a minute, but it's kind of a fundamental and important bright line rule to understand, especially if you're out there on the internet and you're kind of, you're hearing things about what's going on in Washington or California or some of those other states. We're a little bit different here in Utah, so it's just important to start with that discussion. We'll talk about what that means when we get down. So because local government, cities and towns, I think probably at about 7,000 people, you guys will be in that town. That's what it would be called, basically.
Fifth class city.
Fifth class city, yep, or town, yep. They, as you heard me mention, these types of entities are a construct of the state, so state law does govern. But then once you're incorporated, then this all comes together, and that's where we start talking about land use. Okay, so specific to land use, there are a few topics in state law that are bright line rules, and we'll talk about how those work. But then generally, the legislative aspects of regulating land are governed by a couple of different things. So first of all, constitutional, right? The federal constitution does protect property rights. So when you're dealing with land use, when you're dealing with people's property rights, there is a component of both federal and state constitution that is very fundamental to that, right? So you guys have all heard about takings law and eminent domain and those kinds of things, and you all know that our country is based on protecting people's property rights, among other types of liberties. Okay, so again, important to start from the 30,000 foot level and have that lens on everything that we do. Okay, now zoning is an interesting part of that, because as long as zoning has been around, there is a rub between zoning and the Constitution, right? Some might say, how is zoning not in direct violation of my property rights? How is it that there's a group of people that can decide what I can do with my property, and that's okay under the Constitution, right? So some people might ask that question. That's been long settled by the Supreme Court, and zoning is appropriate under the Constitution. you still have to be careful of people's personal property rights, and we'll talk about what that looks like, but again, from a 30,000 foot level, zoning has been vetted through that legal process for many, many years. And putting some limitations on people's property rights has been found to be appropriate even under the constitutional standards. And that's what zoning is at its most fundamental, right? Zoning at its most fundamental, land use control at its most fundamental is really putting a little bit of burden on people's property rights for the greater good, okay? So when you start talking about those kind of things, then we go back, now revert back to state law. Okay, so as a fifth class city, if this incorporation happens, then what does that mean as it relates to land use authority? So the state legislature has authorized local governments to enact these zoning rules and a few other things, right? You heard Wayne mention master plans or general plans. We'll talk about what those are. And then who makes the decisions? You guys are probably familiar with planning commissions. You probably heard a little bit about maybe a board of adjustment or a zoning appeal authority. Those are all constructs of the state, and they all would apply as a city moves forward. So let's start with master plans. Okay, so in Utah, land use authorities at the city, at the local level, and typically, by the way, let me back up just 1 second. So you're all familiar with county level land use, right? Y'all are in that world right now. So sometimes counties, when you're in an unincorporated area, do have land use authority. Typically, counties handle that one of two ways. They either do go ahead and exert their land use authority, or when someone comes in to develop that's in an unincorporated area, they move them into they require that they're moved into an incorporated area. So each county does that a little differently. And that's kind of a county-based scenario when they have an unincorporated ground that's going to be developed. In an interesting piece of knowledge, when you look at the state law, you have Title 17, which is the land use code for counties, and you have Title 10, which is the land use code for cities, and they almost mirror each other. They're very close. Okay, so the same land use controls and same land use authority that have been given to the cities, the counties also have those. And if you look at those two sections of code, you'll see that they're very close. In fact, it's interestingly 17.9A and 10.9A, and they mirror each other. And when they're changed at the state legislative level, which is happening a lot now, many of you have probably heard about a lot of movement and change at the state level through our state legislators, legislature. I'll talk to you about that as well. They typically combine those two. So if you see a bill that affects the Title 10, 9A sections of city land use law, there will be a companion to that is in the Title 17 in the county, at the county level. Okay. So you have those regulations, and as you heard me say before, under Utah law and under the Hutchinson rule, which was a Utah Supreme Court case, cities have to do what's required by the state law, but they can do a whole bunch of things as long as they're not prohibited. Okay, so that's why you can have ordinances that deal with things the state legislature can't even imagine, right? Let's say that you happen upon land use that needs to be a petting zoo or something. They don't want to have all the regulations that go along with the petting zoo at the state level. They're granting that authority to the local jurisdiction, to the local legislative body, okay? And part of what makes Utah different, a little different as well, is Utah has really held firm on the idea that government that's closest to the people should be making those decisions, those important land use decisions. Now, I say that with a little bit of trepidation right at this moment, because there is a lot of discussion at the state level about if they still really believe that all the way, right? So some of you have heard some rumblings about, we think that's true, Legislature's holding the line, regulation closest to the people is the way we want to be. We want those elected officials, the ones that we see at the grocery store, the ones that we're going to see at the boat dock, the ones that we're going to see walking on the trails. We want them to be responsible to the landowners in their jurisdiction. Right now, the state legislature is grappling with whether or not some decisions need to be taken back up to the state level. Some of those conversations are around things like affordable housing. And what that has trickled down to is a lot of conversation about what zoning should look like in Utah. So the last couple of legislative sessions and the next couple of legislative sessions, in my opinion, there will be a lot of conversation at the state legislative level with regards to how are we going to be as a state. The other thing that you'll see, if you were to Google some of this tonight when you get home, you will see that there are states across the country and near us where the state legislators in those states have decided to pull back some of the legislative land use authority from their local jurisdiction. So they've decided to say, you don't get to deal with the zoning on these topics. We're going to make this a statewide policy decision, and we're going to take some of that authority away from you. You'll see that that's quite common these days across the country. There's a lot of conversation again around affordable housing and state legislators saying, this is an issue that really is a statewide issue. We need to grab hold of it. We can't allow our local jurisdictions to be spotty about this topic. So we're going to bring it back up to our level at the state legislature and dictate it across the state. There's a very real discussion happening in our state about that right now. And they have the authority at the legislative level to do that. They could do that if they wanted to. I feel like our state legislature wants to do everything they can not to do that. They want to keep local control at the local level, and many of them are really interested in that, but they are recognizing that there are some statewide problems that they're not sure how to fix. And they're not sure how to have the locals help them to fix. Affordable housing is the prime one that they're talking about right now. Along with that, you'll hear a lot of conversation about private property rights that couple with that, and then developers, our developer partners in the state, oftentimes have discussion or concern or issue or pain points that they would like the state legislature to deal with as well when it comes to land use, right? So if your application processing takes too long, if your ordinances don't comply with state law, or if sometimes this happens, your ordinances comply with state law, but your local elected officials say, well, we don't really care about that. This is too important, and we're going to make a decision that is different than that. And sometimes that happens, and it causes concern, right? So then we'll hear about that at the state legislative level. So all of those things I think are important to understand. It's kind of the state of the state right now as it relates to land use. We've been really stalwart and solid in Utah. I think from my perspective, it's one of the things that has made us so successful. It's one of the things that has made communities across the state so successful. The legislature and legislators recognize that the roads, the transportation needs, the development needs of Liberty, Eden, Nordic, they recognize that those are different than the development needs of Salt Lake City. And that the local elected officials are the ones that know that best. And so they've really tried to keep it at that. But I think it's important to understand that there's a discussion happening out there with regards to that. Okay, so back to master plans. That was a long diversion. Master plan, probably one of the first things that you would do as a jurisdiction, if you incorporate, is to immediately start off with master plan. And by the way, one of the most common reasons people join together to incorporate is land use, right? Most of the time when the effort gets boiling and the discussion gets happening, it's because people are concerned about what's happening with land use in their jurisdiction. Very common, completely appropriate. So a good thing to understand as you go into this. So one of the first things that you would do is look at the look at the boundaries of your jurisdiction, that your newborn jurisdiction, and your legislative, a local elected official, right? In this case, a council of some form would start to make those decisions, right? So sometimes you'll see when an area is incorporated, you'll see the area say, you know what, for a time, we're gonna adopt exactly what the county did. And we're gonna bring that over as it sits right now, and then we're gonna take a look case by case. Sometimes that happens in an incorporation, and that's great and just dandy, right? In that effort, there is this master planning or general planning process. So master plans in Utah are exactly what it sounds like. It's a look at the whole jurisdiction. Typically, it involves discussions about the future. So what do we want this city to look like in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years? What do we want it to be developed as? What are the long range goals? What do we want to incentivize? What do we want to disincentivize? And then how are we going to translate that into a zoning map? So they're really two different things. The general plan is also typically in Utah, not a governing document. Okay, so general plan / master plans, a legislative body, a city council could decide that that's a governing document, meaning that's the rule. Those are the rules. But most of the time they don't. Most of the time they use those documents as a policy guidance document. So what does that mean for someone who might come in for application for a land use approval? They would start by looking at your master plan or general plan, but they would understand that that's not the rule. We have to look somewhere else for the rules. That's just a statement by the city council about what they want this city to be. Broad statement, long range plan, but not a governing rule. Again, I think a legislative body a city council could say, we want our general plan or master plan to be a governing document. I personally, and maybe it's because I'm old school, I don't think that is the right path. But that's a legislative discussion for the city council members to have. Because the reason I like that as a policy document is it can ebb and flow a lot easier. And it's a long range document. When you have then ordinances that backfill that's really where your power, your control, your capability as a local jurisdiction is in those ordinances, in those land use ordinances that implement or seek to implement your master plan. That's really where your rules are, okay? So you'll have the master plan and you'd endeavor to put that together. And you might say, we really like all of Weber County's plan. We're gonna adopt that as ours. You might say, we don't like any of that. We're gonna have some help and get a provider in here to help us, a planner to help us look through this, and we're gonna make our own master plan. All of those things will be just great, right? Whatever you decide. Then as you've got your master plan, which is again not a rule document typically, then you would enact ordinances that are in compliance with state law that then seek to implement that general plan. Okay, so let me just give you an example. Let's say that and I'm totally making this up. I have no idea about what this would be really, right? But let's say your master plan for the northwest quadrant of your city says, we want that to remain agricultural. We want that to remain rural. We don't want any new houses there. We want one house per 20 acres. You know, I'm making it up. That's our plan for that area, long into the future. Okay, so let's go back to what I said to begin with, right? For sure, in that northwest quadrant, you have a landowner. There's someone that owns that property. So that person is saying to themselves at some point, well, that's just dandy. I'm glad everybody wants it to be 1 per 20 acres, but I want to do a Costco. Right? Okay, you got that. You got that side of it. You've got the neighbors that live around that 20 acres or that one house per 20 acre zone. And they're saying, I for sure don't want a Costco. I could maybe go for, a few more houses, but I don't want, and I don't want a gas station. But maybe a couple more houses, I'd be okay with that. You got the broader group here, you got the whole rest of the valley who are like, I don't know what to do. And then whoever the city council is looking at your ordinances and saying, okay, we're gonna use our authority. We're gonna use our legislative authority, and that word is important. We'll talk about legislative decisions versus administrative decisions in just a minute. But to enact an ordinance that controls someone's land, a land use ordinance, that's a legislative activity. That is the city council members saying to themselves on behalf of their constituency, we're going to make a policy decision about these pieces of ground on behalf of our whole community. We're going to make that decision legislatively. Anytime a city council is making a legislative decision like that, like zoning, deciding someone's zoning is a legislative decision. The standards that you have to live by are pretty low. So really, it's a question of judgment. And like if you were to have court discussions or court actions as it relates to a legislative decision, the city council, the local jurisdiction, they win. Okay, in legislative decisions, they win. Now let's talk about why that is. That doesn't mean in our way of life here in our country, right? That doesn't mean that those decisions go unabated, right? If a legislative body, if a city council, if an elected official makes a decision like that, that is their policy decision to make, the way that those are guarded against is by voting, right? So what happens if you don't like a legislative decision that your city council, or right now that your county commission is making? If it's a legislative decision, your authority to undo that or to not like that is by voting, right? It's not necessarily, for the most part, a legal path. It's voting. That's how legislative decisions that you don't like, that's how that happens, right? So when you think about a city council, a local elected official, making those legislative type decisions, that's what they have to think about, right? They have to think about a lot of the constituencies. So you heard me talk about all the different considerations. You have the landowner, you have the neighbors, you have the tax base. You all will be worrying about, and Wayne will help you with this next week. You're going to be saying to yourself, are we going to bear the burden of running this city based on our taxes, or are we going to have a Costco? I know you're not going to have a Costco. Or are we going to have a Costco? Are we going to put some business in here so that we can use some of those taxes? Okay, those are all types of decisions that these local elected officials that you're about to put in are going to have to make. Okay, when they're making those decisions, they're acting on your behalf as elected officials, and they're doing that at a very low legal threshold, which means it's really, they're trying to do what's best, and there are no rules, right? They're making the rules, but they're doing that based on those kinds of discussions, and the way that those get policed, so to speak, I use that term as gently as possible, is by election. Okay, yeah.
And also referendum is another.
Sure, great, yeah, perfect example, yes, referendum is a great one, okay, great example. So, but that's still really voting. In the long run, that's really by the vote, right? By the power of the people, not by the power of the courts, right? So when it's a legislative decision, that's what you're talking about. So it's really important when you're forming this government and when you're thinking about it to know what kind of decisions you're making as a local elected official, okay? Or when you're talking about what's happening at Weber County, same thing applies. When they're making some of the decisions that they're making, some land use decisions are not legislative. Some are what we call administrative. Okay, and let me talk to you about the difference. So legislative decisions, those are, like I told you, they're what policy would I like to set? What rule am I gonna implement? How am I gonna make these land use regulations so that I can get my master plan the way I like it and have the power to maintain it, okay? When you get into the rules are now set, so you have a city council, they've done the work on a master plan, they've put together their ordinances, which are the rules now that you have to live by, okay? There are a lot of those sections of code that are gonna be administrative decisions. Let me give you an example. And maybe you've seen some of this as you've been engaged at the county level, okay? When they're making a decision, when a local elected official is making a decision on a conditional use, how many of you heard about conditional uses or had experience? Okay. Conditional uses are a good example of applying the rules to the situation. Okay, they're 99% administrative. So if in your code that is developed, that is, I'm gonna keep that property, one house per 20 acres, but I might let a gas station in, maybe as a conditional use, okay? In your code, you'll have a list of things that make a gas station okay. And as long as they meet that list, even if they're a conditional use, you grant that conditional use. Now you can add some conditions, and that's where a little bit of legislative discretion is. But from a state law, case law, administrative action, those kinds of things are administrative for the most part. Let's talk about another one that's even more important, more clear. That's subdivisions. Okay, anybody been involved in a subdivision application or seen one go through the county or heard about one? Okay, subdivisions are the purest form of administrative decision. If an applicant comes into you as a city council or as a city, and they have met all of your subdivision requirements, okay? And let's say that in order to keep that subdivision 1 per 20, you have all kinds of setback requirements, you have roads that have to be put in, you have water that has to be found. I know that's a hot topic. All of those things you've put into your ordinance so that you can implement the decision you made over there. If an applicant brings in a subdivision that meets all of those requirements, you have no capability but to say yes to them. And some of you may have seen that at the county level. It's oftentimes frustrating for the public because it's really hard to understand. It's hard to understand how can my county commissioners do this? Why are they doing that? I don't want that. You go to the meeting, you talk about how you don't want it, and someone on that county commission, or more often the lawyer that's helping them will say, yeah, I appreciate all this. I'm glad everybody's here tonight, but remember council, remember commission, you don't have any movement here. You have to follow these rules. This applicant has met all the requirements. You have to grant them their approval. And everybody in the audience that doesn't like it, they're really frustrated. They don't understand why the commission's hands are tied. It's hard to understand that, and they are tied, okay? So that's why it's so important to understand the difference between legislative activities and administrative activities. Okay, yep.
I was gonna have or ask you if you would please to kind of clarify and hit that whole point again, but maybe it'd be better to do it sort of like pop quiz, like you can come out here and say, okay.
The
Can
pressure's
somebody
on.
now explain to me the difference between the administrative process and the legislative process as it pertains to land use?
Let's do it. Who would love to do that? Who has that? Yep, do it.
Well, legislative is making laws or rules, so that's legislative action. Administrative would be administering, but taking what already exists in existence and administering.
Very good. Yes, and I would say that is a perfect example. The only thing I would add to that is in a land use discussion, it's that answer on steroids, okay? It's really important from especially on the administrative side to understand the steroid part of that, because you really are, your hands really are tied. And when you talk about a legislative versus administrative, like let's say some of the things that councils do, this is a perfect example of how you gave, like sometimes they're approving a contract. You know, they're approving the contract for the street sweeper. that's an administrative activity. And it's a little bit different than the land use. There's no real rule for that. It's just an administrative activity, right? So land use administrative stuff really on steroids. Yeah. Yeah.
So if it's okay, how about we talk about the elephant in the room?
Okay.
Is rezoning application administrative or legislative?
So great. I love this question. Who wants to answer this?
Can you repeat it?
Can you repeat- Yes, oh, yes, I'm sorry, let me repeat it. The question was, is rezoning a piece of property a legislative activity or an administrative activity? Yes, legislative, why?
Because you're making the rules to apply in the zone.
And it's really good to know this, rezoning, so zoning authority, zoning power is a very powerful legislative activity, probably the most powerful legislative activity that a local government has. Rezoning a piece of property, always legislative, and always at the discretion of the elected officials. And by the way, from a lawyer perspective, from a court perspective, from a case law perspective, local jurisdictions will never lose a pure rezoning case. It's a waste of time to challenge them, and you're not ever gonna win. Now, the only exception to that is if a local elected official can make those decisions for almost any reason, and they don't have to give any reason. They could make a rezone decision and never make a peep on the record, okay? Except for the only time that they're in the danger zone is if they're making that decision one way or the other based on the protected class type of situation, right? So if they say something like, which is never gonna happen, but this is the only time a case would be in jeopardy, is if a local official is up there and they're like, well, listen, we'd love to rezone this. This is a woman-owned company, and I'm scared they don't know how to move the dirt, so I'm not gonna do that, right? Knocked down in a blaze of glory. So you'll win the legislative rezone process as a local elected official as a city every single time. People won't even challenge it, except for in those very, very rare, so rare, well, you'll never see it in your lifetime, cases where they're making a decision on a protected class status or something like that. Super rare. Yeah, yeah.
What if the elected officials fail to follow some required procedure?
Okay, good.
Can you
So,
repeat that again?
like a noticing or, yes. So great question. There are issues that come with proper noticing, public hearing, that kind of thing. Let's talk about what happens when that does get screwed up, okay? So that gets screwed up. Let's say that they forgot to notice, or they messed up the noticing by 5 days. So instead of 10 days notice on the public website, there were 4 days notice, and people are upset. Okay, great. Let's say that someone's gonna challenge based on that. Here's what the court's gonna do. The court's gonna say, hey, elected officials, you guys screwed that up. I'm sending it back to you. Do it again. What they're not gonna do is they're not gonna say, oh yeah, since you guys screwed up the noticing, instead of R18, we're gonna tell you to zone it A. So again, you could make the claim on that, and a lot of people do. And local governments, by the way, we, the collective proverbial, we take noticing really seriously and are scared. It's not good, right? But in the end game, if you were gonna seek to have something undone because of that, really all that is gonna do is they're gonna have the hearing the next day. They're gonna redo the noticing, they're gonna redo the hearing, and then they're gonna do whatever they're gonna do. You know what I mean? So it's a great question, but ultimately the answer is it's technicality. Now, as I was counseling my elected officials and boards on stuff like that, will say to you, you never want to lose on procedure. So procedure is important, and procedure does matter, and noticing matters. Those things all matter, and they should be taken very seriously, and you never want to lose on procedure, right? But ultimately, is that ever going to undo successfully a rezone situation? It's not. I mean, it might delay it, fair. It might be painful, but it's not going to undo it. Yeah. Yep.
So the only way you could turn around something that was unpopular in the community is from the, using that window of opportunity to communicate for 10 days instead of the 5, and make a couple meetings and make it clear that you guys blew this and the next election comes around, you're done. Maybe they change their tune.
Yeah, and there's also the good old fashioned, some of those decisions you could refer. That's really difficult to do. It's difficult. You guys are in the throes of collecting signatures. You know what that's all about. There are some of those types of legislative decisions that are subject to that kind of a situation. But the real bottom line is you're going to be using the voting machine ultimately, right? In a rezone situation. And remember, again, the reason that is because local elected officials, the most power that they wield is that legislative rezoning power. And it's intentionally set up that way. Yeah. Go ahead.
So you say they might make them come back and redo it. Who's they? Because they didn't hold a public hearing on a big rezone. And they didn't redo it, go to the Attorney General's office. And they said there's no law, there's no recourse.
Right, that's true. So that they would mean someone would have to bring some process or litigation forward. There's also a provision in the code that says if no one makes a claim in that, then the notice is perfected, basically, right? So maybe in your situation that you're saying, that's what happened. If after X amount of days, no one claims anything, but those are private right of actions, right? So it would be a citizen or group of citizens who say, wait a second, that doesn't seem right. Now, again, I think that to me, if I'm the lawyer that someone comes to and says, hey, I don't like this, they didn't do the noticing, let's go fight this and see if we can undo it. I'm gonna say, I feel like that's gonna be a rough situation for you because you're gonna go, you'll probably win, but then nothing stops them from doing it right, correctly, and going through the process and rezoning it the next time, right? Yeah.
When or how are the property rights of those neighbors that might be adversely affected considered?
Great.
Or the greater good of the community?
Yep. So such great questions, right? So there are some processes that are referable, right? So that means you would get a petition together and you're going to go and put something on the ballot, put a decision like that on the ballot and let the whole group vote on it. Very difficult. The standards legislatively are very high to do that. Takes a long time, a lot of effort, and very rare in Utah. Okay. The clear path to that, the most, I don't know if it's most effective, but it is the path is the people who you elect to represent you are the ones you should be speaking to. And they're the ones who hold that capability. And then, right, God bless America. If you don't like it, then the next time, either you run or you help them not win again, right? That's really the construct of it. When it comes to zoning, really only when it comes to zoning. There are a lot of other things that there's less power with, that are governed more strictly, that are tightened down. They don't have the local officials don't have as much wiggle room on, but zoning is the purest activity. Great question. I saw some more. Yep.
You talk about solutions when an administrative decision is made that runs counter to or is misrepresented by the law. So if a staff planner misinterprets something as written, what are the recourses then?
Yep. So let's talk about. I won't talk about how it's set up in Weber County because I'm not an expert on Weber County. But let's talk about how it could be set up. Okay. So typically in that situation, there are ordinance provisions that allow for what's called a land use appeal authority. Okay. And historically, land use appeal authorities have been anything from a zoning administrator to a board of adjustment to a city council. Jurisdictions have set them all up differently. Okay. So let's say that a conditional use approval was made. Let's do the staff example that you say. Okay. let's say a staffer is reading an ordinance and he or she is saying, this ordinance says this action is gonna be taken in. And you read the ordinance and say, that's wrong, right? There are typically in most land use ordinances, an appeal of a staff decision. And that appeal of a staff decision typically goes one of three ways. It either goes to what's called a local land use authority. And now these days, that's typically one person. So someone in the city has been designated as the local land use authority. And you can file application and say, I want to appeal this staff determination. And then it goes to that person. That's how a lot of them are set up now. Some of them are set up that those kind of appeals go to the city council or county commission or those places. And some of them still go to places like the planning commission, board of adjustment, those types of things. So in each jurisdiction is different. Not every jurisdiction has appeal of a staff decision, like your example, but typically, that's how it would work. If there was a staff decision that was made. Now, a couple intricacies around that. That staff decision actually has to be a final acted upon decision, right? So if you're just in a meeting with a staffer and they're reading the ordinance one way, but have not taken a formal step based on that reading, it's not yet right for an appeal. So it depends on where you're at in the situation. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah, okay.
We hear a lot about by rights, zoning and by rights building. And our assumption has always been that we couldn't undo any of that. That if it's zoned 3 acres and somebody has 3 acres, the legislative action could not take place to make that 5 acres.
Oh, no, that's not right.
So that could change.
Okay.
Well,
That's really unpopular.
Well-
Typically, it's a very hard decision, right? It's hard for local governments, but yes, can you down zone a property? The answer is yes. Can you up zone a property? The answer is yes. Now, by right, that's a different, so if they're vested in something, okay, you're not ever truly vested in zoning until you take the next action application wise, okay? So let's just use an example. Let's use our 1 per 20 acres, okay? Let's say that you've got that 20 acres out there. You've zoned that, you've master planned it. We want to stay one house on 20 acres. You've zoned it R120, but nothing, it's just sitting there vacant, okay? When that person makes application for that one house, then you're giving them the house, right? Because they're now vested in that zone, vested in their right on that property, okay? Yeah. So zoning can be, it's a really tough thing to go through and rezone. It's and let's go in eyes wide open from an incorporation perspective. Tough to have those conversations, tough in these jurisdictions to have those conversations when you're making changes. It's also a very specific legal analysis, okay? So I'm talking broadly here. You'd have to make that analysis case by case and decide what they're vested in or not vested in. But typically just zoning, if there's no other action that's been taken on the property, zoning can be changed. It's a tough thing, right?
and ordinances also, all of the ordinances that the county currently has could be changed.
You bet. Now, let's talk about that for a second. People are still gonna be vested. There are some people that will still be vested in those ordinances, depending on where they're at in a process or where their property is. That's the first thing to remember. The second thing is, sometimes you will be dealing with things that used to be called grandfather, grandfathered rights, those kind of things. If something exists on the ground and you change the ordinance over the top of it, that is gonna be grandfathered. Meaning they're not gonna have to tear that down and make it what we want it, right? Under certain circumstances, but they're grandfathered. So it's very property specific. Bright line rules are as I have shared, but it's property specific. Yeah.
Go back to the appeal process for legislative or administrative process. What role does the state ombudsman office play in this? And
Yeah.
when can or or should or should not be used?
Yeah, great question. So the ombudsman's office has actually been really valuable in saving a lot of jurisdictions from a lot of trouble, right? So I think that they're really a pretty good outlet for both property owners, developers, and local jurisdictions. I am a big advocate of the ombudsman's office. At first, I think we as local government officials were nervous about it because you don't really want a third party butting in. But the way that they have rolled that out is a pretty good process. So you can use the ombudsman's office, and by the way, cities, neighbors, applicants, they're all, it's available to all, okay? This actually might be a really good one if your notice issue was up, right? And there was some question about the noticing, it might be a good path, okay? But it applies in almost every, you're capable or able to use it in almost every land use situation. Now, there are a lot of them that you wouldn't, like again, rezoning. It just is what it is. It's just a legislative thing and it's a real strong power and there's not really gonna be a thing there, right?
Hey, would you take just 1 minute or less and talk to everybody about what the ombudsman's office
Oh, yeah, sure.
actually is?
Great point.
Why?
Yeah, so it's a state set up organization staffed by lawyers, typically land use professionals, I would say, with a set of guidelines. And those guidelines keep them kind of in the box with regards to the decisions they can and can't make. Typically, what they exist for is to help local government officials, developers, property owners understand what the rules are when there's a sort of miscommunication or a rub that people don't want to take to court, right? Let's face it, court is ridiculous. It's never going to be happy for anybody. It's a bad idea. It's a failed situation. And it's hard and expensive, right? But if you can have a third party help you when you're like this, understand where the lines are without crossing the line into policy discussion, without crossing the line into, well, you should really like R18s better here than R120 because come on, right? You know, none of that happens at the ombudsman's office. This is how the rule is. This is how these things apply to it. And it helps people understand. So it's a state office. Again, there might be 6 or 7 lawyers there now, I'm not sure. And anyone in that path of land use can take their application or take their grievance is too strong of a word, take their question, take their issue to the ombudsman's office. They will issue typically a formal written opinion that then the local jurisdiction, the neighbor or the developer can utilize to solve the problem. Or let's pretend like the ombudsman says, hey, local city council, you are not applying the law correctly. And they get a formal ombudsman opinion that says that. Then the local elected officials still do it. Okay, there are provisions in state law that if they do that, if they take that action in the face of the ombudsman's office, there are certain repercussions, including in some cases, attorney's fees. So the other thing to know about land use and land use cases, land use litigation is it's very, very, very expensive, very long drawn out process. And the value of attorney's fees in those types of cases typically help whichever party is struggling along come a little closer to the solution. So it's a very valuable tool. A lot of jurisdictions use it. There are, if you go to the internet and search, I think we do call it I think it's called the State Land Use Ombudsman's Office. You'll get that. If you Google that, you'll get him. You'll see that there are a whole big list of formal written opinions. And sometimes those are kind of interesting. Like if you had questions about a conditional use, if there was an application that's kind of bugging you, you could go look at their examples and you could see what they've done in other cases. But they're all listed there and you can just read them right up if you're bored. Yeah.
So does that freeze the process? In other words, if some great citizens being challenged, the person can't develop it until that's resolved.
Great question. Yeah, it does typically, and there's a shot clock on that, right? So the ombudsman's process can't put this in spin cycle forever, but there typically is a pause, and then that pause there's a time frame for that they have to respond in a certain time frame and get their answer back in a certain time frame, so that no party is stuck in oblivion for very long. But yeah, that's a great question. Yep.
I think one of our concerns is we could well be overwhelmed by applications. And I know that there are rules about how speedy you need to be.
There are.
What kind of bind could that put us in?
So there are rules about how speedy you can be. A couple of things that help with that, okay? So there are a couple of tools in state law that are applicable and that help with that. The first is there is such thing as a moratorium. Moratorium puts a hold on everything, or sometimes it puts a hold on a specific thing. A local council could decide we need a moratorium on all conditional uses, because we're getting all these conditional use applications and we're not ready yet, or we don't have it right yet. Okay. Now it's important to use that tool really carefully, because you only get really one shot at it. There's one little exception to that, and it can only be for 6 months. So it helps you to get your ducks in a row for about 6 months, okay? So that's one method by which you can have a little bit of a pause. The second is every applicant that comes to the table, so to speak, that brings their application, it is required before those clocks start that their application is complete. And it's a kind of a tough thing for applicants, even if your process is really simple. Even if you think it's really clear, a lot of times applicants come and their application is not complete. And so a lot of times that gives a little bit of breathing room as well. So the person that the local jurisdiction has processing those will take a look at the application and say, hey, you're missing these 3 or 4 things. So we're not going to take your application in and certify it as complete. And so the clock doesn't start. Okay, now you can't mess around with that very long. And if they do come with a completed application, you have to accept it, but it's very common to not have that. Yep.
So I understand that in 2023, the legislature passed the requirements of what complete meant for a development plan.
Yep.
And they gave communities up until February 1st of this year to implement that. What is the difference and why is that important?
Yeah, great question. The reason they did that was because there were a lot of jurisdictions that were kind of, you know, maybe using that as a little bit of a difficult hurdle, right? They were maybe implementing some things that were a little excessive in the legislature's eyes. So they made those changes. So the legislature this is a perfect example of what I talked about at the beginning. Legislature said, okay, we're gonna have to now have some common standards, and they put those into place and did give the cities some time. So when you see that, when the cities need some time to put that into place, that's just because they want them all to implement it by a certain time. As it relates to a new jurisdiction, you're gonna have some time to get your ducks in a row and get yourself set up. But so a brand new group, of course, will have time to facilitate that, if that's the question.
But what is the definition of complete now as opposed to what it was before?
I would love to have that memorized and be able to roll that
Okay.
off my tongue for you here, state legislature wise, but it's the things you would suspect, right? So I could bring up the code for you, or in fact, I'm happy to send the code section. I don't have that one memorized, but it's all the common things, right? Like, and it's different, a little different for each type of application, by the way. It's a little bit, you know, different for a subdivision application versus a rezone application. So there are some provisions there. Sorry, I wish I did have them.
Land use, or let's use rezoning notifications. What's required to be noticed? Who is required to be informed of the notice? And how long is that duration?
Okay, great question. So state law also was just recently sort of cleaned up as it relates to noticing. When you're talking about a rezone, legislative action specifically called out as a rezone, there are a couple of requirements. The best place to look and the most common requirement is this 10-day notice on state noticing website. Are y'all familiar with the state noticing website? Okay, if you're not familiar with the state noticing website, that's the first place I would go tonight when you're bored and you're on the internet searching all these things we talked about. You can sign up for notifications on the state noticing website, and everyone puts their notices there, okay? So typically they're not in the paper anymore. Sometimes they are, but typically they're not. They're not required to be necessarily. Now there's a caveat to that, okay? There's a state law requirement that basically, I'm gonna give it in broad terms, okay? It's basically 10 days notice on the state website. And depending on the situation, there might be some additional notices that are specific to certain things, okay? The other thing you have to be aware of is there are jurisdictions that still have additional noticing requirements in their own ordinances. So some places, some counties and cities still will say for things like rezones, we're gonna follow the state law, but we're also gonna notice everyone within 300 feet.
That's what I was looking.
Yeah, so that's all really dependent on each jurisdiction. There's been a commonality made at the state level, and then you still have to understand what the other jurisdictions or what a specific jurisdiction has also added into that. Or you can even argue in some cases what their practice is, okay? So let's say that maybe it's not written in their ordinance, but their practice has been 300 feet for conditional uses. So normal notice and 300 feet for conditional uses. They should really be doing that every time if that's their practice, okay? So it's a nuanced answer, and it's a subjective answer based on where you're at. But state law is very particular.
My concern is somebody who maybe they inherit a piece of land from their parents or whatever, and that's where they're gonna put their cabin, it'll be nice and quiet. And if they live out of state, they're gonna be looking for notices on their stay here. So if they need more than 10 days to respond, they may not get the mail within 10 days.
Great notice. So let's talk about that for a second. The reason that we all have our property ownership listed at the county, okay, so whatever the property ownership is at the county for a particular piece of property, that's deemed the legal noticing spot, okay? So if we were gonna rezone that particular property, we would be sending a letter to that person as well. Now, whether or not they're getting the mail within 10 days, tough luck, man. And let's say that their address is wrong. Let's say that they have the old address. Or let's say because they just inherited the property, it goes to dad's property address and not to whoever, right? Tough luck. It's our responsibility as property owners to make sure our addresses, our property addresses are correct at the county recorder's office. And that is the defense. And by the way, as a local jurisdiction, as a soon to be likely city council of your own, you're on the flip side glad for that. Because if we were required as local elected officials to really hunt, let me just tell you, it's real rough. So it's good to have that one place that's deemed by the law to be the theme. And then it's incumbent on all of us as property owners to make sure that that's correct. That's how the law
And a
works.
follow-up question on rezone. What if the municipality decides to rezone a parcel of land that will very much negatively affect the people adjoining, say, a gravel mining pit or a rock crushing place
Yeah,
right next
sure.
to a hospital
Sure.
or upwind of a local school, and the dust is gonna overwhelm, the noise is gonna shake the operating theater. How do they respond to the municipality saying, this is something we want to oppose, we don't think this should happen here?
Yeah, great. These are great questions. So this one's a really nuanced one as well, right? Because again, if you're counting the noses of your elected officials and that's the will of that body, then really all you get to do is go speak your piece. Or you get to go find them at the grocery store and say, hey, I gotta talk to you about the gravel pit, right? It's a representative form of government, and that is how it works with regards to that. And really, when you're talking about rezoning, if you have the votes, if the developer has the votes, or if the gravel pit has the votes, it's gonna get rezoned. And your recourse, your right is to speak about it, and then, of course, to vote, right? Yeah.
I think this leads into a question I had, land use code, the permitted versus conditional use
Great.
on a piece of land.
Yep.
So in many cases here, like a gravel pit, it may be a conditional use. It's been explained to us from the county level that conditional use permits basically going to be approved as long as the applicant can show and mitigate health, safety, and welfare.
That's right.
Can you talk about that and what's the use of conditional uses
Great question.
versus a permitted use?
Yeah, you're nailing this thing. Okay, so let's talk about that, right? Let's talk about it from the strength of a land use code versus the flexibility of a land use code. Remember, I said the most strong thing a local government can do is rezone. Okay, so let's put a pin in that for a second. Why would you ever have a conditional use in your code? What good is it? And how do they function? Okay, so you said the law on conditional uses correctly, and the law is well settled. Conditional uses are permitted uses with conditions that mitigate the detrimental impact. That's it. Don't expect someone to deny a conditional use, and if they do, if you have a local elected official or a group of them that are denying conditional use, it's fraught with legal problems. They will likely lose that when they're challenged at the district court level in Utah. Conditional uses are permitted uses with conditions. So why would you ever use a conditional use? Such an awesome question. Hey, from an advisor to a local elected body, my answer to that is your strength is in rezoning. Your strength is not in conditional uses. So if you don't want that use there, do not make it a conditional use. You rezone it or zone it to what you want and use that power. Don't think that you're going to use your power at a conditional use level because it's not going to be good, right? Conditional uses, very rare, limited provisions. It's really when you actually want something in a certain location as a local jurisdiction. But there might be a little bit of traffic around it, or there might be a little bit of light that you need to mitigate. You know, maybe you do want a corner store, but it's right in the edge of a neighborhood. And so when the corner store comes, because you've decided you want that, you want to be able to say to them, hey, listen, love it, 2 thumbs up, but we got to have lighting that goes down, right? So to me, conditional uses should be in your code very rarely. And from the outside looking in, you have to recognize that those are permitted uses. And if you have a jurisdiction that is denying that, they're going to be faced with some litigation probably. Yeah. Yep.
We had up in South Fork, had a boys group home not long ago in the neighborhood.
Great question.
And the community, I don't know how they heard about it, because that 300-foot rule would not apply to the whole community, just the immediate neighbors.
Right.
Anyway, a lot of complaints went about that. And it was just a group home, out-of-state boys coming, and they ended up going on the highway there and calling themselves a school, which we had no ability to prevent from coming in. So now it's established there, kind of out of place, but luckily it was a good thing. I mean, not a good thing, it wasn't a negative thing that they keep to themselves. But it seems that the community wasn't aware of it unless it was word of mouth. You said the 300-foot rule, maybe you can address why it's so limited and not the whole, affects the whole area. Plus, they circumvented it anyway, and it is a quote school.
Let's talk about, this is great also, you guys are really good. There are a set of uses that you will not have as a local jurisdiction any control over. Group homes actually are one of those, okay? And the reason that group homes are really hard to do anything but put some general regulations around is because they're protected. They have constitutional protected status. And it's a real thing. And it's a real troubling thing for jurisdictions and very, very difficult. So you set up some provisions, you can't prohibit them, can't even prohibit them in the neighborhood. If someone wanted to put a group home right next door to me in my house, right next door, they're protected. You get to have it. Okay, now, can your code say you have to have off-street parking? Probably. Can your code say, you have to follow the occupancy standards, right? So if you have 10 bedrooms, you can only have 20 people. Okay, yes, you can have those kinds of regulations, but anything else with a group home, okay? Schools, great example. And there was just a change last year, and schools, by the way, mean charter schools, normal district schools, and now they mean something called a micro school. Have you heard about a micro school? Yeah. So last legislative session, there was a bill that was run that put, I think maybe it might have been 2 years ago, last year or 2 years ago, put into place the same protections for what's called a micro school. Micro school, think of it like a school in your neighborhood. Yeah. That's another great example. Third one, churches. Okay, so churches, again, you probably have heard that sometimes jurisdictions blow right past that, and they still have some things to do with churches. Like you probably heard about the big controversy over in Wasatch County with the Heber Temple, and you might be saying to yourself, but Nicole, isn't that a church? The answer to that is yes. You can have some regulations around those types of things, right? Lighting, perfect example. Parking, number of parking stalls, the kinds of regulations that you'd apply to everyone. You can't prohibit them. And you really have to be careful from a federal constitutional provision perspective in anything but really straightforward land use based requirements on those kinds of things. We are coming upon a few other things I think that will fall into that category. You've heard me talk a few times tonight about affordable housing. Those kinds of things are in the mix a little bit on that. There are a couple of others as well, yeah.
So I just wanted to go back to the group home example, but a little more broad.
Okay.
So my daughter lives in Baltimore, and she lives in a house, and the ordinance there has nothing to do with group homes. It's actually enforced because it's a college community.
Yeah. So like renting a room or something.
Right, so, but the city ordinance is that no more than 4 people who are not related are allowed to live in the dwelling. How does that affect the group home situation? I mean, I think some of this relates here, but.
No, it's great question.
But it certainly, if you wanted a group home and you only had 3 people in the group home here that lived there, that would be a different story. But is a group home exempt from that if you want?
Yes. So I'm going to give you the really blunt and true answer. And unfortunately, Wade and I have what I would say is the preeminent case on this issue in Utah that we had happen early in our careers, where those exact questions were
I've seen it in Iowa.
brought to the forefront. So you will see a lot of ordinances that have this family definition of 3, no more than 3 unrelated adults can live in a home, okay? That definition violates the Constitution. Why do you still see it in ordinances? Well, yeah, and for the most part, and also because, sometimes you can have that work, right? And I think jurisdictions have seen that work. I think that the law is relatively settled across the country. And that if a jurisdiction were to be challenged on that, especially specific to group home, there would be a serious situation. And the reason that it's heightened with a group home is because the folks that utilize a group home, for the most part, will be found to have protected status. And if even one of them have constitutionally protected status, then that trumps our local capabilities. And it's a tough thing for neighbors to understand and to deal with, but that's the reality of it.
You talk about affordable housing. It's brought up a lot. It's enforced on us. We're safer in a county setup than we would be in a city setup. People kind of are just opposed if if they can avoid it, they'd like to.
Sure.
They kind of think it's likely. But up here, we're on a national, perhaps international housing market. Affordable is, our friend Richard says, an oxymoron up here. The minute anything goes up, it goes on some resort market. So how does that all work for us?
Yeah, so great question. So because if you were to be incorporated, my understanding is you're about 7,000 people or so. Your population kicks you into the affordable, moderate income housing plan requirements as a local jurisdiction if you were a city. There are some rules that come along with that, which basically boil down to you have to have that as a component of your master plan. So you have to plan for it at some place in your city. And there's a list of a la carte choices that you can choose from as to how you're gonna facilitate some of those needs in your community. You also get the opportunity to assess what your community in fact does need, okay? So that's kind of the state law side of it. As it relates to the politics right now, as I mentioned before, I think as it relates to affordable housing, it's a really tough term to work with. It's a tough thing to legislate. I think our legislature wants to try to find solutions. I think they are reticent to take that control over. But there is a lot of conversation and a lot of pressure at the state level to do that. And what would that look like? That would look like they would say things like, no jurisdiction gets to have a R1 type of zone, meaning one house per certain number of square feet or acreages, right? You don't get to have that. That's what other jurisdictions have done. Other states have said, no more residential zoning, which means you could have a developer who come in on an acre or two, and if they're doing affordable housing, which typically is defined as 80% of the adjusted median income for the county. The county. Yeah, which is for you guys, it's an important number to understand.
Could possibly need it.
Very low, yeah, it will be very low.
We're double
Yes,
the county.
totally, yep. So you can see how that would work and how that would affect your jurisdiction, but that's what other communities have done. So far, the legislature has been, other states. So far, the legislature has been pretty reticent to do that, but there's a lot of talk about that every year and continuing talk because of the pretty desperate need of affordable housing. Now, things like communities, like I kind of classify, and maybe this is not appropriate, but I kind of classify your community in my own mind a little bit as a resort community. And I think a lot of the tools that resort communities have used or chosen to use are things like workforce housing. Let's talk about how we attach some workforce housing to a particular location that makes sense, right? And in that case, you might only need 10 units of workforce housing based on how your structure is set up. And that could be in a location that makes total sense for you and could look like a lot of different things, right? It could look like it houses the people in the summer that help take care of the lake or whatever, right? So there are a lot of tools that jurisdictions have used. I'm sorry.
Would those be owned by the city? I mean, do you force a private person to have to develop them?
Well, okay, so there's a lot of talk about that too. There are a lot of jurisdictions outside of Utah that have said, if you're gonna develop any kind of residential, you're gonna include, you developer, are gonna include 10 units of affordable housing in every single development. That's another way that some states have gone. I don't see Utah going that way. I don't think there are cities that require that, okay? Perfect example, a lot of jurisdictions and a lot of discussion of that in Summit and Wasatch County for the same reason that I talked about. They're resort communities in a lot of ways. They need a lot of workforce housing, and there's been a lot of discussion about if you're gonna build these 5 estate lots, I need 10 units of workforce housing somewhere else, or I need you to commit to 10 units of workforce housing. Local jurisdictions could do that right now under state law if they had that in their code. I don't see the state adopting that path. I don't think they will. I don't know, but I don't think that's the likely path.
How do you define who gets to live in quote work? I mean, obviously people who work here, but
could be very transient. What if you live and work for 1,000, but then you don't work, let's just say in Ogden Valley? And you move, you work somewhere else, you find a job down in Ogden.
Yep.
But once you're in, you stay in that affordable housing, because a lot of good reasons to have affordable housing up here besides short distance. to work.
Totally, yeah, no, totally, and it goes back to your question as well. A lot of those things depend on who owns it, who operates it, and what the parameters are. Much of the time, true affordable housing or attainable or workforce, depending on how you define it, is deed restricted. So a lot of times those requirements are set forth in the deed. Sometimes there are jurisdictions that have housing authority, and some of the units are owned by a county or a city, local jurisdiction, and then the parameters are set by them, right? So it's very fact specific, very dependent on those couple of things. Typically, the bright line way to think about it is affordable housing under state law definition is 80% of the AMI in your county. And that's an easily you could Google that tonight and you could find your number. And I'm guessing it's in the below 40,000 range, maybe 43. If I remember right, maybe Weber County's 43,000 adjusted median income per person. Okay. That's kind of the bright line provision. Now people moving in and out, and how is it structured, and is it more dorm-like, or is it townhomes for families? Those are all variables that depend on who owns it, how it was set up, how it's deed restricted, all of those types of things.
I wouldn't be worried about people, you're concerned about people who actually work here. The young man down that I talked to back down in Maverick starts at 4:30 in the morning and drives from Morgan. Can't afford it up there. So not that, what if somebody works up there that leaves? What if people come in?
Yep.
Or for that purpose, they work up there and it's a nice place to live.
Yeah.
And then that aren't actually planning to stay here.
Sure. Yeah, no, very common situation for like, again, I call it resort. So to speak.
Well, how do they develop or deal with realities of the market? You have, quote, affordable housing, and let's just say, for example, it's $200,000 home. Within 6 months after they're completed, we're in a recreational area. People want to live here, either full-time or part-time. And within 6 months, the house is now $400,000, maybe $500,000. So now we have non-existent. How is that realistic, market-driven, gonna possibly work?
Yeah, so great. You guys are so great. Yeah, no, so great. And it depends again on how it was developed and what the restrictions are, who owns it, where the money came from. That's the exact problem that I think the legislature is grappling with right now. Things like, do we even as a legislature want to mess with the generalized marketplace, right? It's a very tough thing for them to legislate around, because we know how the market forces work. And how do you protect that? And how do you handle that? And it's a tough issue. It really depends on who owns it, where the money came from to build it, and how it's deed restricted. And you won't solve that problem unless you have those three things and a few more things.
I think that a lot of that's pie in the sky, quite frankly. If you fit the definition of your average income, and you buy a house up here and somebody offers you double or triple, how long do you think you're gonna stay there?
Absolutely. Yeah. And you're only gonna do that if you're deed restricted. Right?
I guess my question would be, I don't understand the difference in the current climate. I know there's discussion change between the rules for county versus the city, which I think would be the most important for incorporating. If we would be under different rules for affordable housing, workforce housing as a city than as you put.
No, okay, so that.
Excuse me,
answer to that-
can you repeat that? I don't think people
Sure,
on
oh
the
yeah,
phone would
let me
have.
repeat the question. So the question is how are the affordable housing rules in particular, if they are different from being under county jurisdiction versus being under local jurisdiction. Okay, right? Is that good? Okay, so it all couples back to the conversation we've had from the beginning. Right now, as it sits today, except for the requirement of the moderate income housing plan that you have to have in your master plan, which counties have to have also. Local jurisdictions have the ability to zone or not zone for affordable housing, right? So the answer to your question is, it is no different. There is no special rule for counties versus special rule for cities. Right now, it's no different. Title 17 deals with it the same as Title 10, except for if the county has made a legislative decision that deals with affordable housing in a particular way, okay? So by zoning a property for affordable housing, or the opposite, by zoning it for not affordable housing, right? So there's no fundamental difference, no bright line rule difference. And as it moves to a city jurisdiction, if you're to incorporate, right now, you'd be in that same situation. You, as local elected officials, would be saying to yourself, what are we gonna do about affordable housing? And what rules are we gonna implement or not implement? Same as what the county decisions are right now. Does that make sense?
Yes, so as a county, they do not necessarily have to have affordable housing. You know, they can up here, but it's not as required, but once for a city, that would be an absolute requirement, no.
No, it's the same requirement. The counties have the requirement to do moderate income housing plan, same as the city.
And the requirement is a plan, which is nothing.
That's
It's
right.
not law, it's not code.
That's right.
Okay, so it's a plan,
Yep.
it's a wish, it's a whatever.
Right now, today, that's exactly right. Yes, thank you. Yeah, and let's see, let's go right here, and then there was a question over here. Yes. Okay. Blue shirt, red orange shirt, blue shirt.
Two comments. On hers, the county has to deal with the low income or the affordable housing. But the county has a choice of where to put it. Ogden. And if we incorporate, we have to deal with the same ordinance and we have a choice of where to put it, but it has to be within the city.
Yes.
That's the difference between being in the county
Great, yep, great. point.
versus being in the city.
Great point.
Okay.
Yep.
The other question I have is this issue of requiring developers to do something in exchange for their right to develop. You used the example, we'll let you do that condo project, but we need 20 affordable housing units, and so you're gonna do those as a condition of doing this other. We know, or there's been representations that we've got some bridges up here that have some problems.
Yeah.
Does that extend to that? Developer, you can do that condominium project, but you're gonna rebuild this bridge.
Okay, great
Can you
question.
go that far?
These are great, this is a great question. That's called an exaction analysis. You guys heard the word exaction before? Okay, exaction is when you're extracting from a developer something in order for them to be able to develop, okay? So there are very strict regulations around that. Typically, those types of improvements are handled by impact fees or some other regulation in your code that would deal with transportation around development, okay? So the answer is it depends. I would also say that the question you gave me is very tenuous if you were just gonna say to them one night, we will grant you approval if you fix the bridge. You're probably gonna have a problem, right?
Unless that bridge enters into their project, and then it could be.
Yeah, then we should still probably be talking in the realm of road impact fees and kind of a broader discussion. And even if you were gonna do a straight up exaction, there's a formula, there's an analysis that goes along with that. You have to be really careful, and people get sued, cities get sued all the time for screwing that up, okay? Or sure.
Yes, you sold me. This is very complicated. We talk about class 5 cities and how do you get this work done? Is it a volunteer planning commission? How many funded people are there? What observations and lessons learned have you seen that have gone poorly or well?
Well, here's what I know. Here's what little I know about this. That is, it's really a tough thing to start a city. It's a difficult but important task. And those early years, there are a lot of those really tough questions that you have to answer. What I also know is that it's completely doable, and you do typically have, and you heard at the first here, you have to basically count on about a year where you're working on those things. Typically, you would have contract providers. I know some jurisdictions still rely pretty heavily on their county for some help in the early years. And then you get
I'm specifically planning commission. You mean they rely on
Planning
county
commission?
planning?
No, planning commissions come in pretty fast, right? And planning commissions are not really your planning arm. You shouldn't think of them typically as your planners, right? They are your recommending body. They're like your recommending body. That's just the best way to think about it. So while they can be involved in the discussions and should be engaged in the master planning and the zoning discussions, they're not the workers, in my opinion, necessarily. They're not the worker bees in the planning arena. Does that make sense? Okay. And they're volunteers, and they're, yeah.
So I noticed you've been going on for about an hour and a half.
Oh,
Do you want me to stand up and
You
take
could.
5 minutes for you? You need longer, can I get you anything?
I
Okay, so
didn't realize, next week I could ramble.
I was kind of
We have
leading
lots
into
of
this,
questions.
because I did want to add a question if I'm not interfering, or add a comment if I'm not interfering too much. So you said something at the very beginning of the brief that I thought was really important and worth emphasizing again. It goes directly to your question, which is that and I'll put it in order, the general plan, the zoning map, and the zoning ordinance that you start out with. Those kinds of questions are why that is such a critical step. And one way in which we do have a little bit of an advantage with, which Nicole might not even know about, I don't know if you do or do not, but to your planning commission question, Ogden Valley for years has had a planning commission, went through a very good process in terms of putting together a general plan, which has recommendations for zoning in it, and I think
affordable housing.
yeah, and I think they're generally pretty
Pretty
well
close.
supported within the valley. So the point I was making with that is certainly if there was a vote and if the vote passed and if the city was started, that step in adopting whatever that zoning ordinance to start with, along with the map and along with the general plan, would be critical to your point. How do you get it done? How do you get it started? How do you start from a good foot so that you're not messed up right off the bat?
And really important. I mean, if that's really some of the fundamental reasons to do that. Important. Yep, okay. Green shirt.
You've got about 20 minutes before you fall down and we, goes to ask you them. One of
I can obviously talk.
one of the questions we should be asking you and give them to us for 10 or 15 minutes.
Yeah, no, I'll tell you right now, you guys have asked great and very sophisticated questions. Really, it's truly impressive and sophisticated. I can tell that you've been immersed in this and that you thought about it and maybe been involved in a few go arounds on land use stuff. So I would say really from my perspective, you've asked all the important questions as it relates to land use. If I were going to advise you again on things that should be top of mind is to remember that legislative administrative situation and really I will always preach and have from the start of my career 2 other things, and that is never lose on procedure, right? Like the question we had before, don't ever lose on procedure. So make sure you have procedure and you're following that. And that zoning authority, it's almost to the level of a sacred authority, right? Because you're dealing with people's private property, right? And as long as you remember that, and remember that that's the most powerful tool that a local jurisdiction has. All of the other land use tools should be used sparingly and are ancillary. The most powerful tool is that zoning tool, but it's also kind of I hesitate to use that word too strongly, but it's a kind of a sacred tool. And if you're mindful of that private property right as it relates to the good of the whole, then you're in the right spot. So those weren't questions, but those would be my last 5. Okay, hold on. Blue shirt and then front. Yep.
So, in that interim year between, assuming the vote goes in favor of incorporation, can we have an elected body that can start actually making decisions? There's a 12-month period there where the county still controls. And let's make up, the county does things that we, the people up here in the valley, do not agree with. What recourse do we have to go back and undo those decisions, if any?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question and it is fact specific. So we had a little bit like that question earlier. So it really depends, right? Zoning, you're never really vested in your zoning until you take another action, right? So a property owner could have a piece of property that's zoned R120. And if they never did anything with it and you said, county, that was the worst zone ever. I want to do R110. Go for it, right? Now, if that person in the meantime had an application in, a completed application in for that house, then they're vested in that. They're vested in the zone and they're vested in the rules at the time and you can't undo that. So to answer your question, it's fact specific and property specific. So, so there are some things that you could potentially undo, probably the day-to-day actions that they're taking, the conditional uses, the subdivisions, you're not gonna be able to undo those. But if there's a broad sweeping rezone or something like that, maybe it's fact specific. Great question. Yep.
So geographically, we're huge.
Yeah, you are.
And once upon a time, we had 3 planning commissions about 20 years ago that dealt with different sort of the traditional neighborhoods up here. Have you ever seen that in a town like we're talking about, where we had more than one planning commission advisory group?
Yeah, I've seen it. I've heard of it outside of Utah. I have not seen it inside of Utah. I think that sometimes they are styled as community council. And they're given some, I wouldn't say land use authority, but some recommending authority, you know, typically that'll be more in the master plan arena. So there are cities in Utah that do that are not at the level of planning commission, so they don't fall under that state code that says this is what planning commissions can do. But the community council model is alive and well, I would say, in many jurisdictions in Utah. I have seen the planning commission edge in other states. I think even though you're I mean, personal, even though it's pretty vast, that's a little bit of a tricky thing to have 3 different planning commissions. I would say, especially for a small jurisdiction. So it'd be something that I might have to sleep on. If someone were asking me whether that's a good idea or not, you know? Yep.
Back to the affordable housing question for a minute. Does the state see it as a strictly numbers game in terms of the number of units or the number of units served?
Great, also great question. And I think they, that also is fact specific, right? When you look at the a la carte menu of things that jurisdictions can choose from to have in their moderate income housing plan, you'll see both, you'll see opportunities that touch both of those calculations. I think that from a livability and longevity perspective, they're shifting now to see that you really can't just throw up a dorm style such situation and put as many people into it as you can and have that be a livable and sustainable land use. I've heard the legislature talking about that even during these summer months. So I think they're leaning more towards the number of units rather than people served, but
There's a spectrum
there's lots.
between dorm style and single family 3,000 square foot,
Totally,
right?
yeah.
So cottage style, fourplex,
Yep.
shared yard, that kind of thing are all much cheaper to build.
Yep,
So
totally.
you get the density without.
Yep.
doing this.
And they're really getting, I think they're seeing that. They're starting to see that in a really real way at the legislature. So to answer your question, I think right now the a la carte menu looks at both.
Sure.
But where they end up, I don't know. Other questions? Yep. Let's go right in.
Talking about the affordable housing issue again. We talked about the county AMI being used as the baseline stuff. If you go incorporated, does that mean we're stuck with the county thing still, or does it become our AMI?
No, it's county by state law. Yep. And that's really standard, by the way, and it folds into the federal some of the federal requirements. That's why they use it. It's a pretty common standard.
Well,
Yeah.
here's a follow-on question to that. We also right now have to comply in our building standards with the Wasatch Front part of the county. Can we have the mountain standard applied here if, once we're removed from the county for our building codes? Which is insulation and things like that?
Yeah, more roof.
Because now
Yeah.
we have to be the same as the county.
So state law is interesting as it relates to building codes. Technically, the whole state is covered by a particular set of codes, and then jurisdictions can layer in. That is city by city, so you as a city can make those determinations. I am interested that they don't already have that up here. No? Okay,
So we're the only mountain valley that doesn't have the
extra layer.
extra layer building code.
Interesting, yeah. No, you could, yeah. There's a couple little tricky things to that when you're implementing in addition to what the state
Are
law.
you telling us we need an attorney?
Well. Okay, let's see, right here and then in the back.
I want to make more of a comment versus a question. And just a reminder, why we're going through this exercise of incorporating is that as Ogden Valley representing less than 2% of the voters in Weaver County, when a legislative decision is made by our county commissioners and our only option or only recourse, there is a decision made that we don't like, is to vote them out of office. And because of our isolated community, we really have no option. And that's where we're basically why we come to this place. So just want to make that comment.
This goes back to the transition period, and what, if anything, can be undone. Infrastructure, water, sewer, big deal across the state, particularly here in the valley. We've had 2 PIDs, or physical infrastructure districts, established. And here there's 2, possibly 3 more on the table. There's 1 community redevelopment agency in place. I hear there may be a couple others on the table also. If those are put in place in this interim period, can those be redone or undone for those at the state level? And you got to live with it.
I'm gonna say no, but also a little fact specific, so it depends, right? PIDs are a unique and sort of new entity, but they are an entity, and I will tell you that if either of those, whether it's CRA, PID, or other tool, if any of those have been tied either to a tax rate or bonding, they cannot be redone or undone. There are abilities to change those, but remember, many of those have their own boards set up particular to that entity. And so the authority sits with those boards, not with a commission or with a city. Okay, so you have to think of those kind of like you think of a water district or a, it's the same type of legal entity. So for sure, if there's a tax rate that's been applied, an assessment that's been levied, or bonding that's occurred, you can't undo any of those. And unless you catch one of those in the time period of creation, probably not undo. But boards can make changes to those entities just like any other entity, right? So if a board was in place and they levied a 0.3% whatever, and they wanted to do 0.4 the next year, whatever, so there are some changes that could be made, but probably not undone unless you caught them right before they were, approved by lieutenant governor's office or in that early stage. Good question. And those are pretty good tools. I don't know anything about the PIDs here. I don't know how expansive they are, how they're set up, or for what, but in my experience, they're relatively good tools. And as a local government, should there be one here, those are tools I would at least be knowledgeable of and consider for purposes of infrastructure.
What would you suggest as a process from this November's vote for incorporation? So first November of electing officials, that could be done to an expedite the process of formalizing the master plan, potentially ordinances before that time, so it should be.
A really good question. It sounds like,
Could you repeat it?
oh, I'm sorry, yes. The question was, what would be suggested or recommended to, speed up the process or smooth the process of creating the ordinances and, master plan from November to a year from November? And it sounds like to me that maybe you're well on your way from there's a generalized, master plan that maybe from an Ogden Valley perspective, people feel pretty good about. Seems like you're not starting from scratch all the way. So I think that's a good thing. Really, for me, I think having my experience is having really dedicated, right? So the folks that are dedicated to this effort and participate routinely and in a way that is facilitative is going to be your best help. And then I think a couple of professionals, I think you're gonna need a couple of professionals that can help you guide through that process quickly and smoothly, because it's kind of and you guys have learned this, I know, difficult to convene a group, difficult to gather opinions. And as the people in charge, maybe one of these next days is also tough to balance all those opinions, and having maybe a couple of well-placed professionals that have convened those discussions before and have led through a planning process before, who can help you navigate the legalities just a little bit. I think that that's probably going to be helpful. And then I would just say dedication, stay dedicated to it, because that's what makes the difference at this level. The grassroots that you as a group have created, it's going to be a heavy lift, and it can take dedication. That's what I think.
The gentleman spoke last time, said steal from many other towns.
Yeah.
Any towns you recommend we should get to for the land development?
Yeah, great discussion, great idea. There are a lot of outlets for that, and there are a lot of kind of older school experts that could and probably would help you just in a volunteer sort of a way. Towns, if I were going to borrow from a town, I'd probably pick a pretty long-standing 1 or 2 layers size above you town to look to, right? Because a lot of the smaller cities that you've seen formed, they will just take the county ordinances and enact those. And sometimes their codes are just a little rougher.
Any towns to avoid?
No, I can't think of any really, I think we're getting it together pretty well. But there are certainly some that would be more akin to what you need here. Perfect example, some of the mountain towns and cities probably have some good advice for you. The league is a great place. They'll really be helpful anyway. They want to help cities develop and be facilitated in a good way, in an appropriate way. So they're a great outlet for that too.
Is that where we could find some of these professionals we need? The league?
Yeah, and we know them, just ask me.
What is the league? What is the?
The League of Cities and Towns. That's a great question, I'm sorry, yeah, the League of Cities and Towns.
Utah League of Cities.
Utah League of Cities, yes. Utah League of
But their website doesn't say that I couldn't find a place on there that says if you're new town, call this person.
Oh, yeah, Wayne knows how to get hold of them.
So just to be clear, I did reach out to the League of Cities and Towns for that very reason. I said, hey, do you guys have a starter kit? Because that'd be pretty cool. And they said, yeah, we've been thinking about that, but we haven't gotten around to it.
Yeah, there's
yet."
not a
So,
starter kit, I will say
Yeah.
that, but they will willingly and happily answer almost any question. They also know, of course, many of the people that can be helpful. There is a program that they have that is I'm gonna get the name wrong, administrator.
We still own the Range Riders, but I don't know what
The legislature has provided funding for an administrative advisor at the league who is really open for all the general calls. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily land use experts, they have land use expertise, but they're gonna be able to help with all the other things too, and answer a question on the fly and that kind of thing. So there are resources available at the league level, and again, Wayne knows how, and I can send out names of who to call and who to talk to. It sounds like you're talking to people already, and they'll wanna help be helpful too.
And let me jump in one more time. As you can see from our presentation coming up, I'm putting Wayne on the spot here, but we have asked him to look at a transition plan to help us understand the process that we'll go through and what we should be prepared for and what steps we need to take day one. So that is something he's looking into us, and hopefully he'll be providing some of that in one of these upcoming presentations.
They all start November 4th, right?
Well, something like that.
Well, and Wayne really does know what to do, and you won't find anyone better in the country really to help you. So I'd keep him close, bring him lots of treats.
That one works.
Yeah, no, I don't know about treats, but.
Before we give Nicole a round of applause, because we hit our 2-hour mark at the library. Reminders, next Tuesday, we're doing this on a more difficult subject, taxation. Bring your friends, come back. We'll have experts and answers. So let's give Nicole a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry
Hey, we'll
about
turn
that.
the Zoom meeting off and you can talk to Nicole.
Come on up. Thank you so much. You bet. You bet. Nice to see you all. Fun. It's fun. It's exciting time. Recovering employment and labor lawyer, but it's